Welcome to Season 6, Episode 6 of Solarpunk Presents, which is all about emotional literacy, which is your ability to recognize your own emotions and those of others and respond accordingly. And how once we can all do that, life gets better for everybody because we don't get so mad at each other, and we also have more patience for each other and more understanding of what other people are going through. Before we dive into this episode, I would just like to remind you that we need your support. Otherwise, we're just shouting into the void here. So join our Patreon, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and click like, write us some reviews, all that kind of fun stuff. Thanks. And now, on to the show.
Hi, listeners, and welcome back to Solarpunk Presents podcast. Now, on the podcast, we've been talking a lot about Solarpunk values and goals of community, of harmony, of living together and co-living arrangements, things like that. And we've talked about conflict, a lot of which stems from passionate feelings like anger or sadness or a sense of self-righteousness or even emotional manipulation to feel those things. Christina and I were wondering how to avoid being emotionally manipulated in the first place and being able to recognize your emotions that are propelling you into conflict. And it turns out that the term for that is emotional literacy. I wanted to know a bit more about this and more about emotions, frankly. And when I went looking, our guest's name kept coming up over and over as someone who's done a lot of work in this area. So today's episode features a discussion between me, that's Ariel, and Dr. Tiffany Millacci, all about emotional literacy. So thank you so much for chatting with me, Tiffany.
Thank you so much for having me.
Could you tell us a little bit about yourself, like who you are and what you do?
Sure. Well, I'm Dr. Tiffany Millacci, and in short, I'm an educator. I teach elementary special education as well as some university courses. And I'm also a researcher and writer for positivepsychology.com, where I've had the amazing opportunity to deliver professional development and guest speak for incredible blogs such as Solarpunk.
Positive psychology is a field of psychological theory and research. Basically, it's the study of the optimal functioning of people, groups, and institutions, focusing on positive subjective experiences, individual traits, and institutions, and aims to improve quality of life. It is pretty new. It was recognized as a field in Western psychology in 1998 by Martin Seligman, who chose it as the theme for his term as president of the American Psychological Association. It's a reaction against past practices in psychology that focused on mental illnesses and ended up really putting an emphasis on negative thinking and quote-unquote maladaptive behaviors. Positive psychology is a westernized expression of what various societies and cultures around the world and throughout history have variously referred to as the good life. The Anishinaabe concept of Minobama-Dizewin, for example, can be understood as a collective sense of well-being, looking out for each other, and being in good relationship with each other. Positive psychology as a field studies how humans can better achieve that good life. Okay, back to the episode. So, what is emotional literacy? Would you mind defining it for our listeners in a basic sort of 101 style manner?
Absolutely. This is sort of a newer term, might be unfamiliar for many, but emotional literacy is the ability to recognize, understand, manage one's emotions, as well as the emotions of others. It's critical for our mental health and well-being and has a profound effect on the psychological resilience and mental health just in general. And the 4 R's that you may hear about of emotional literacy are recognition, regulation, resilience, and relationships. And the 6 stages that you might be familiar with when you hear of emotional literacy is recognizing one's emotions, understanding those emotions, expressing emotions, managing the emotions, developing empathy and social skills, integrating emotional literacy into daily life.
Oh, wow. Thanks. I was going to ask you why emotional literacy is important, but I think you already covered that. It sounds like it's pretty crucial to, being a human in the world.
Absolutely. Emotional literacy is so important because it's not something we're typically taught explicitly. I think we're getting better at it, with the educational movement to focus on the social emotional learning. However, it's a difficult concept to teach. And I think it's often a challenge to teach because we have to actually model it. And that's difficult to do. One, because we ourselves might not have been taught these skills. And two, we might not be familiar with what emotional literacy actually is.
Okay. But what can emotional literacy kind of help us do? Like you sort of covered it a little bit in the definition, but I was wondering if you could elaborate on that. Like, what is emotional literacy? What does it unlock for us?
Sure. Just in general, mental health, mental well-being. It helps us promote and maintain the mental health and well-being. It helps us to handle stress, maintain positive relationships, and navigate personal conflicts. It's going to help us identify when to seek help and which coping strategies we might want to use and when to use those coping strategies. In schools, it's going to help us be better academically. With our academic performance, that's going to be improved. It's going to enhance our social interactions and reduce the behavioral problems in the educational setting. In the workplace, it's going to lead to higher job satisfaction, improved team dynamics, and it's going to decrease that chance of burnout for us.
Yeah, I guess if you are emotionally literate and you kind of know like how you're in tune with your own feelings and you're able to really relate and empathize with other people, it makes you just a better person to be around in general. And it sort of helps with strengthen those relationships, whether you're at work or at home or just hanging out with your friends. It really sounds like something that can be really useful for just
life in general.
Yeah, in general, yes. I was struggling to encapsulate that because it's
so broad.
Yeah, it seems to apply to almost every part of our lives. And I mean, nowadays, emotions tend to run pretty high when we're talking about things like, say, climate change or, politics or religion, or these are all really emotionally charged subjects. And it's difficult to sometimes navigate conversations if you are so sort of caught up in your own feelings. And it's important to feel your feelings, but maybe not in front of, the person you're trying to debate.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, I mean, if I wanted to get better at emotional literacy, like how would I even begin? So could you recommend some good starting places for me?
Absolutely. I'm going to start with mindfulness, which might include some yoga, breathing exercises, just being able to emphasize that present moment and the awareness. That's going to encourage our emotional regulation. Body awareness exercises such as Tai Chi or body scanning will also help with that awareness. Starting a reflection practice of journaling or answering questions about our emotions will help us with our emotional literacy, maybe answering specific prompts to self-assess, getting just a temperature reading on where we're at with our emotional literacy. Active listening is also an important aspect because it's important to really concentrate on what others are saying, and not only what they're saying, but just more fully understanding the message they're wanting to convey and considering the body language they're using, the tone and the cadence of their words. That's going to be important in the active listening.
Right.
Some books I would recommend on the topic: Daniel Goleman's Emotional Intelligence, Why It Can Matter More Than IQ is a really good place to start.
Oh.
And I would always recommend Manage My Emotions, What I Wish I Had Learned in School About Anger, Fear, and Love by Dr. Ken Marks. This is a great book to just explore these areas as adults and how we can manage our emotions better. He also has a children's book that addresses these topics as well. And I actually had the opportunity to co-author a book for teenagers on this topic.
That's really cool. When we're talking about mindfulness, that brings to mind, like, I think something that might be on a lot of people's minds right now when they think about emotional literacy and emotions is how this might be like related to self-help, like specifically the self-help industry, like talking about emotions is really popular in like a lot of the self-care that's promoted to us in the global north. And unfortunately, it can really reinforce the message that if you're experiencing negative emotions, that's an individual's problem. Like that's a you problem. And so you need to go buy self-help books or have like expensive spa days to de-stress or travel to like quote unquote find yourself. Like basically any talk about emotions kind of tends to have the baggage of like this entire industry that's dedicated to getting us to like buy things so that we just feel better. And I get the sense that emotional literacy is really not about that. But would you mind sort of picking that apart a little bit more?
The common association, not a terrible association, but an association nonetheless. So let's unpack that. I find self-care to be a really tricky topic, and I love the idea of designating time for ourselves and doing things that make us happy. This is essential for not only thriving, but actually surviving and finding, meaning in our lives. And I agree that it's absolutely a market for this, but I'm going to challenge anyone towards working towards building a life where self-care isn't needed, where they're able to enjoy, the most of, the better part of their day, and they find fulfillment in that. Of course, we all have stressful jobs, and my hope is that we could embed this self-care within that. We don't have to specifically designate time. We don't want to create a life where we need an escape from.
And that's a good goal to have, is to, construct a life that you enjoy. Don't want to just leave at the end of the day.
Yeah. And self-care is going to be very different for everyone. A lot of people say, oh, massages are the best, where, other people might just be happy, time by themselves reading a book, or, self-care looks so differently for everyone.
Ariel popping in here to say that access to care, access to having the time and money to spend on positive and enjoyable experiences, and the power to shape your daily life to include more of those experiences and less of the negative, stressful factors, is pretty bounded by your social location. Everyone deserves to feel nice and experience good things, regardless of class, race, gender identity, sexual orientation, or any other bullshit identity markers that our society uses to separate us into hierarchies that make it even more difficult to connect to each other. Just had to make that clear. Okay, that's it for me.
As far as the negative emotions, they also have a bad rep. And while negative emotions aren't desirable, they're a fact of life. And the resilience that we develop from the emotional literacy, that's going to help us experience emotions, whether good or bad, and be able to respond to them appropriately.
Negative emotions. I'm going a little bit off the questions that I had prepared for you, so no pressure for you to have an answer right off the bat for this. But I'm just thinking in terms of having those negative emotions, it's unavoidable, right? With emotional literacy, if you're in a situation where you have sort of negative emotions, so I guess you identify the emotion, and then what?
You would want to think of a coping strategy. Like, what works for you? Do you need to do some breathing? Do you need to take some time out? Do you need to do some kind of reflection? Just finding a technique that would work for you after you recognize that you're having that negative emotion. You want to think of an appropriate response.
Okay. And I'm not a bad person for having that negative emotion, right?
Absolutely not. It's just a fact of life. If you didn't have the negative emotions, then you wouldn't experience the positive ones. You wouldn't be able to identify the positive ones.
Yeah, it seems to be just a very human thing to have negative emotions. And I think some people are more negative than others, and that's fine. I feel like with sort of this science of happiness, it can seem like we're just running away from negative emotions entirely, but that doesn't seem to be the case.
No, and that kind of brings to mind toxic positivity, which is sort of, positivity. There was such a movement saying good vibes only. And that can be kind of dangerous because you're just kind of sliding through other emotions and not identifying them. So it's important, if you have a negative emotion, it's important to be able to identify that and feel that emotion and just learn from it. And I think that's important when we are interacting with others. If they're having a negative emotion, it's important to not just glaze over it and say, oh, tomorrow will be better, or it's not so bad. It's important to validate that emotion.
Okay.
But that might be rearing off in another direction of
No, that's great actually, because I mean, we've been talking a lot about relationships on the podcast and relating to other people, specifically other people who might not hold the same opinions as you. I'm the kind of person who, like, I avoid conflict, I hate it. And so I instinctively will like turn a conversation around if there's even a hint of a negative emotion from like my conversation partner. I'll like change the topic or whatever, but that's not super useful because I'm not addressing what's going on. And hey, maybe we could have had a really good conversation about that one topic. It's just that I don't know, I feel scared of negative emotions, and I would venture to say that a lot of people do.
I agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's something we're just taught that, like, as a child, it's inappropriate to have, to be like angry and destructive or basically disruptive of everything.
Sure. And I think now there's a focus on teaching children that it's okay to be mad, sad. You just have to respond appropriately. Like we can't throw things when we're mad, but we can take some time to ourselves and take some breaths or do some coloring. So I think that's important starting with children now, because we were taught, differently growing up, I'm sure, that you just can't be mad. But now, you can be mad, but there's different responses that are appropriate.
Yeah, and I think that ties back to my earlier, I sort of said I'm a bad person for being angry. And like, I do think though that sort of, I guess, abstinence only education of kind of like you're not allowed to be mad. The correlative there is that if you are mad, then you're somehow morally wrong or something like that. I don't know. That's something that I feel gets picked up by that messaging a lot. And so a lot of people are scared to kind of say that they have a negative emotion or have a negative opinion of something for fear that other people will automatically look down on them. It will affect their social relationships. It will just make everyone think that they're or think a little bit less of them. I think positive psychology or emotional literacy just kind of really equips us not only to like actually think about and process like positive emotions, but think about and process these negative emotions too. And that seems really valuable to me.
Absolutely. And I think you brought up a good point. And you just really have to know yourself well, to have the best interactions with others. So knowing your emotional limits, I think, is important not before, but to strive for the best interactions with others.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, knowing that, say, talking about, I don't know, electric vehicles is going to make you fly off the handle, then maybe not engaging in a conversation about electric vehicles or being, emotionally equipped to, like having taken a couple of deep breaths beforehand, like helps you sort of be prepared for that whole like know thyself sort of mandate. Sort of, I guess that's what emotional literacy is sort of working towards.
Sure.
Yeah. I mean, I mentioned positive psychology, but I do think also that term tends to have like a bad reputation or like an association with self-help and like going to therapy to deal with problems that positive psychology just kind of convinces you are a result of your like individual brain chemistry and not because of like wider systemic issues. Like it's not that you hate your job because it's terrible. It's because you yourself are depressed and you need to, I don't know, just think happy thoughts. So is there like actually a science behind happiness then?
There's absolutely a science behind happiness. First, you have the biological principle, the chemicals in your brain, such as the dopamine, there's the serotonin and endorphins that help you regulate your mood and happiness. There's also research that supports that gratitude, mindfulness, and social connections are associated with happiness. It's Also important to know that happiness can be described in two forms: hedonic, which is the pleasure based, and the eudaimonic, which is meaning or purpose based.
Oh,
So,
interesting.
the pleasure based root of happiness would be going on a vacation or eating a delicious meal, whereas the meaning or purpose based happiness premise would be building relationships, volunteering for a cause you feel strongly about, and pursuing personal growth.
Okay. So it's something that you sort of take satisfaction from, I guess.
Absolutely. Yep.
Okay. And it seems like that sort of, sorry, what did you call it? Eudaimonic?
Yes. Yep.
Wow, I like that. Eudaimonic comes from the Greek eu, which means good, and daimon, which means spirit or deity, and has been used since ancient times in philosophy to refer to the highest human good. It sounds like it's something that takes place over a long period of time and is more sustainable. I see you nodding.
Yes, I agree with that. I think that's more of a long-term form of happiness, whereas the hedonic is, just eating your favorite meal or getting a massage or something like that, a little bit shorter term.
Okay, like a quick fix kind of thing.
Sure.
Okay, all right. Yeah, so we're looking for something a little bit less quick fixy and more sort of sustained in terms of being able to sort of lend to your overall like mental health on an ongoing basis and just makes you a better person to be around.
Right.
Can you tell me, how did you first come to the idea of emotional literacy, positive psychology? What was like, did you read about it? Was it introduced to you in school? What sort of, because I never really heard about it when I was growing up. I think in the past like 5 or 10 years, it's become more of something that I read on the internet or hear people talking about in conversation. But I'm curious to know how you sort of like what your pathway was.
Sure. So I write for positivepsychology.com and the topic came up. And I jumped on that topic because being an educator, I know how controlling your emotions and managing your emotions, how important that is. And I'm always interested in knowing how to better my practice with social emotional learning for my students. And that topic came up and I jumped on it. And there's more and more research coming out about emotional literacy. And just seemed like an important topic.
Yeah, it sounds like emotional literacy is something that can really help us not hurt other people.
Mm-hmm.
So like when we know what's going on with ourselves, then we know how to treat others. Yeah. Okay. I wanted to ask you actually a little bit more about emotional literacy in the context of sort of groups and what happens, say, if you're in a conversation with a couple of people and you have a certain level of emotional literacy. So you kind of clock what's going on, but the other people don't seem to also realize that. What would I do in such a situation?
It's a very good question because we can only control ourselves, right? We can't control others' reactions or feelings. So I think being emotionally literate, we would know our emotions and our reactions very well, and we would be able to sense others' emotions and reaction and kind of guesstimate their reactions. So if someone seems to be in maybe a heightened state, we might want to take a few steps back and, like you mentioned earlier, maybe change the subject if you have to. Maybe it's not the appropriate time or place to have a debate.
Mm.
So maybe that needs to be tabled for another time or just revisited later.
Yeah, for sure.
But unfortunately, we can't control others' reactions and we can't teach them to be emotionally literate.
Yeah, it's not something that's our responsibility, I guess. I'm wondering a little bit about, and I don't know if you have any experience with this, but with some people who are neurodivergent have a harder time recognizing the emotions of people around them. And so like, does emotional literacy and positive psychology, does it think about that? Is it more of a, or right now, like, is it more sort of focused on the neurotypical experience? Sort of what is kind of the state of the field, I guess?
Well, I'm not sure that there's as much research out there as we would like, but we definitely know that within the neurodivergent community, emotions are difficult, whether it be recognizing other emotions or expressing emotions. It's definitely an area of challenge. And, I'm thinking at the elementary school level, we do have programs to address and explicitly teach emotions and emotional regulation. And there's a lot of research out there on teaching emotional regulation at the elementary school setting. As far as adults, I don't know if there's too much research out there that addresses their needs. But, with the difficulty in navigating emotions, it could lead to increased anxiety, depression, and behavioral issues. And that's definitely a concern with people who are neurodivergent.
Yeah,
So
sure.
it's definitely a challenge for them.
It sounds like there needs to be a lot more research in that area. Neurodivergence, like everybody's brain kind of works differently, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it can be, and everybody, like expresses emotion differently, like in different cultures around the world. Certain like emotional signals that I would pick up on as meaning like this person is happy or this person is, having sympathy or something like that could be, my signals could be completely crossed. I could just be very wrong. It sounds tough to navigate.
It is. And it makes, social activities a challenge. Also navigating daily life and maintaining relationships is also more of a challenge because of that difficulty in identifying emotions of others.
Okay. Say I was having an emotion like and I was angry or okay, say I was feeling angry, but it didn't really make sense for the situation. How would I go around like naming that emotion? Is or maybe that's the I don't know if that's the proper way, but you say I'm angry or I'm sad, and it's kind of like a blanket statement. And so I don't know, like how would I sort of narrow that down?
Well, I think it's okay to just, recognize and say, like, I'm angry, but I don't know why right now.
Mm.
Maybe it'll take some time for me to process whatever's going on. And it could be, I know for me, sometimes if I have too much caffeine, I get angry more quickly. It could be because I had, too much sugar or something. So it could be
Mm.
something biological, or it could be an incident that truly made us upset. But I think it's okay to just say, oh, I'm upset right now and I'm not sure why. I
Mm.
think that's perfectly fine to say,
Okay.
not only to yourself, but, with others that you're around.
Yeah, and I mean, hopefully those others would be sympathetic to that.
Yes, yeah, we would wish that.
Yeah, I was going to tell a long rambling story about being hangry, but you know what? I'm just going to save that for later. Or maybe not at all. But I will say that I feel like it's kind of nice. It's very handy for there to be a word like hangry out there because I often didn't really think about the sort of biological sort of effects on my own emotions,
Mhm.
and that it's sort of a more universal experience. All right. Well, thank you so much for agreeing to sit down and speak with me, Tiffany. Is there anything else that you would like to say to our listeners about emotions and emotional literacy?
So I think, we covered how important it is and how it can really affect our daily life and how it's going to improve, our interpersonal relationships, relationships at work, with friends, family members. So we really touched on the importance of emotional literacy as well as a couple of things to start with. So I think we've covered it for now.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for agreeing to come on the podcast and agreeing to teach me a little bit more about emotions and how to manage them, really.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me and letting me discuss this important topic.
And that's a wrap for this episode. Let me see. What am I feeling? I think what I'm feeling right now is joy that you're still here and still listening. Thank you very, very, very much. Until the next episode. Thank you for listening to Solarpunk Presents, a podcast hosted and produced by Ariel, Kroon, and Christina de la Rocha.
The audio for this episode was recorded in part on the traditional territory of the neutral Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples.
And in Germany. The opening and closing music for this podcast is Water Cooler Gang by Monkey Warhol, available for use under the Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 International License.
Don't forget to support us on Patreon at patreon.com/solarpunkpresents.
Every little bit helps us keep bringing you discussions and interviews.
Until the next episode, keep dreaming.
And stay solarpunk.